Good afternoon and welcome to part 2 of the USC-Adolescent Trauma Training Center's webinar on treating self-injurious behaviors in traumatized adolescents. This is part 2, intervention. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. John Briere is a professor of psychiatry in the behavioral sciences at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California, and he is the director of the USC Adolescent Trauma Training Center. Dr. Briere is a past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. He's received an award for outstanding contributions to science of trauma psychology from the American Psychological Association and the William N. Friedrich Lecture, Outstanding Contribution to the Field of Child Psychology from the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Briere's newest book is Treating Risky and Compulsive Behaviors in Trauma Survivors. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Briere.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. As you recall, the last one of these two presentations were focusing on the theory and etiology of self-injurious behavior. And as I promised you today, we're going to spend an hour talking about how to intervene in situations where you have a client who's self-injuring. I'd like to preface this, though, with the obvious, which is for some clients, self-injurious behavior is just one of a number of distress reduction behaviors they're involved in. They may also be using substances and dissociation. Typically, self-injurious behavior arises from more complex trauma presentations, often involving childhood trauma and or attachment dysregulation. When you look at all those things together, the implications of that for treatment is that although we only have an hour here, many people would say that working with self-injurious clients is not a simple job. It can take some time. And it may not be that the stuff we'll be talking about here today will be what you'll be using with your clients on a regular basis, but maybe just during times when you're trying to address self-injurious behavior. And you may remember self-injurious behavior is basically self-affected bodily harm of a socially inappropriate nature without obvious suicidal intent. So the first thing you see on this slide is in some sense almost the most boring in a way, although it calls on the entire psychotherapy outcome literature, as well as the experience of A, people working with self-injury, and B, people working with traumatized adolescents, which is that the therapeutic relationship really has to be the important background for this work. I would even go so far as to say that if you don't have a good working alliance with your client, the odds that you'll be able to help them with this or related problems are lower. And basically, the therapeutic relationship allows the client to encounter positive feelings associated with acceptance, non-judgmental, positive regard, and compassion from the therapist. As we'll also mention briefly later, the therapeutic relationship also provides positive emotional and cognitive experiences that can serve to counter condition activated trauma or attachment memories during therapy. So this relationship building and support, do not skip that step. It often requires attention throughout therapy. Sometimes clients who are dealing with things like self-injurious behavior or compulsive sexual behaviors, or perhaps certain forms of substance abuse, will feel quite ashamed of the fact that they're struggling with these things, and therefore it's quite important that the therapist countertransference is not manifest. I think I mentioned this later, but the danger is that people who are intentionally hurting themselves tend to trigger therapists because we have a lot of responsibility, but it feels like we have very little control, which may mimic our own childhoods, or just that would be an unfortunate experience no matter how you had it. So sometimes what this means is our response to clients who are engaging in risky behaviors might be more diluted or might be slightly infused with some version of judgment or something to that extent. It's very important in the therapeutic relationship, and we'll see this later on when we talk about working with a trigger grid, that the client's general feeling is that the therapist sees the client as having undergone experiences that make self-injurious behavior entirely logical, that do not reflect the fact that self-injurious evidence of a personality disorder or psychopathology, but just that it is a coping strategy, as we talked about last time, with a lot of downsides, in that the therapist's job is to figure out with the client whether they would like to change the use of that avoidant defense, which they almost always seem to. Our research suggests over 80 to 90% of self-injurious people want to stop that if they could, even though they report that it is helpful for them in controlling negative emotional states. So we want to have sort of almost a team. I sometimes say that psychotherapy with trauma survivors, especially maybe adolescents, is less like a physician curing a patient and more like a personal trainer trying to help an individual maximize their ongoing functioning. So it's not that we are fixing the client, but we're working with the client for them to do their own work in terms of skills building and processing. And in the context of that, that tends to avoid the feeling of criticism, judgment, etc. I don't actually recommend, for example, that you use, as we mentioned last time, diagnoses like borderline personality disorder or behavioral addiction or whatever else, because those labels can be distracting. They may not be entirely accurate, but because the overall approach to therapy is that you and the client are working on the same side. Their use of this behavior is only evidence of what they're up against. It's not evidence of their failings or their character defects or anything like that. Also, the therapeutic relationship means that we need to also attend to how safe the client's feeling. In relationships that are more stable and strong, the client's more able to share that with us. But as we mentioned last time, self-injurious behavior often interdigitates or is co-present with suicidality. Remember, though, that per what we talked about, rarely is self-injurious behavior a marker of suicidality. It's not parasuicidality. It's a separate avoidance strategy. The only thing is, for a number of people, especially people who are having more extreme problems, self-injurious behavior may be unsuccessful in decreasing distress, which may lead to suicidality. Also, people will get sort of confused when they're in the depths of self-hatred, feelings of emptiness, feeling abandonment, anger, etc., because they may not even be able to discriminate very well from us whether they're suicidal or self-injuring. As you can imagine, a lot of us have done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews of self-injurious people in clinical settings, and some of them can't even guarantee you that it's suicidal or it's self-injury. They just see it as sort of a mix between the two. But ultimately, there are quite strong differences between these two. Suicidality obviously needs our more immediate attention, more definitive attention. Self-injurious behavior can produce injuries, infection, disfigurement. It has caused death in a few cases that I know of when inadvertently a blood vessel was cut or something else happened. But generally, it's not considered as acute of an issue as suicidality. This is why those of you who are in psychiatric environments, it may be that you've been trained or you experience that you hospitalize anyone who self-injures. The problem is, for many of our clients, self-injury is a regular method for a form of homeostasis induction. So they don't actually need to be in a psych hospital. So one of the critical issues that we have to do is figure out, do they need protection right now from themselves? If they're suicidal, they may or may not need an admission. If they're self-injurious, generally the times when we would do that is when we really need to interfere with a very powerful form of self-injury that involves disfigurement and involves more severe outcomes. But if you read the evidence-based literature for the interventions with self-injurious behavior, they will generally say that hospitalization won't be helpful in the classic sense, although it may be helpful in the very short term to forestall more severe behaviors. As we talked about last time, emotional regulation is one of the key parts of why people engage in self-injurious behavior. We referred to the notion of reactive avoidance, that in fact, what some people do is engage in behaviors that distract so that they don't have to feel painful internal states. And that's actually a combination between the painful internal states they carry in terms of how badly were they abused, or how much attachment, dysregulation, or insecurity did they have when they were young. But as I mentioned last time, even if you have a lot of trauma in your background, if you have relatively okay emotional regulation, the odds are you may not have to to engage in self-injurious behavior as a way to regulate feelings. If you think about your caseload, you probably have seen quite a few people who've had really horrible things, and yet they're not engaging in self-injurious behavior. Also, we tend to find that self-injurious behaviors arise from childhood traumas more than adult traumas. So when you generally, what you're looking at here are kids who've had their early life experiences and their relational experiences connected and conditioned to periods of pain, distress, helplessness, hopelessness, sometimes self-hatred, emptiness, etc. Those very early feelings, when activated in the absence of sufficient affect regulation training, may result in self-injurious behaviors. So there is a little tiny bit of a diagnostic take home here, although I wouldn't make too much of it. But generally, when we see someone engaging in self-injurious behavior, we assume that they probably don't have as much emotional regulation success as other people have, probably because early trauma has a negative effect on the learning of emotional regulation repertoire. And so ends up what happening is, as a child, you get better at avoiding emotions and regulating them. And then later on, when you're triggered into negative states, you have to use something more dramatic to pull yourself out of those negative states. So to the extent that that's true, most of us believe that the first step in working with self-injurious behaviors is to increase emotional regulation capacity. Although if you think about it, we have early traumas and attachment dysregulation, and we have, we've got a complex presentation of those two things. What some people are going to want to do is use a cognitive behavioral exposure model to try to help the person process the early trauma. Because if you think about it, that would also work, right? If you're suffering from more pain than you have ability to handle pain, one, we could try to help you decrease the pain, or two, we could try to increase your ability to handle that pain. Decreasing the pain associated with childhood trauma usually comes from emotional processing, which in people who have enough emotional regulation skills, that's a great idea. But you've probably heard this before, and you probably integrate this in your own work. If you have a client whose emotional regulation is so compromised that the triggering of painful events requires them to engage in something as dramatic as self-injury, we're probably not going to want to go to emotional processing yet. And we'll talk about this later in a later slide. I hope that makes sense. That's sort of the idea here is if you can't regulate your emotional states, it might be counterproductive for me to have you go into negative states by talking about painful events, which you then can't regulate very well. So although we have usually trauma and inability to regulate post-traumatic difficulties, in most cases, we won't start with processing trauma. We'll start with stabilization, teaching emotional regulation, and various skills that will allow the client to keep from transitioning from negative emotional states to self-injury. We'll also want to see if we can increase the client's ability to tolerate negative emotional states, which may mean that we're going to be doing things that are not so much increasing their overall emotional regulation capacity from the past, but instead that we're teaching them how to figure out ways in the present to deal with overwhelming emotional states on a moment-by-moment basis. So let's just talk about some of those. We sometimes divide them into two sections. One is distress reduction, one's affect regulation or emotional regulation. Distress reduction usually means helping the client to tolerate increasingly higher levels of emotional distress without being overwhelmed. So a lot of dialectical behavior therapy and a lot of the work that we can do here may be that as we have you talk in handleable chunks about painful experience, you can get better at reducing those experiences. But it's also true in the acute here and now when clients are suffering from very powerful negative triggered states, we may want to work with them to see if they can reduce their distress acutely in the moment. So if you see, these things you see there, an interesting point to make here is the time to teach people about emotional regulation of triggered states and maybe trigger interventions is not after they've been triggered. What we really want to do is have them have coping strategies available to them that they learn in therapy when they're not being triggered and when they're maybe before they've even processed any trauma. So that means that the early sessions are often less activating because they're more focused on emotional skill development. It's not just before trauma processing though, because often during the process of therapy, we may ask the client to go back to a mindfulness exercise or relaxation exercise to bring down the escalating feelings they're having in therapy. So the first approach would be relaxation and breath training. Relaxation basically means, can you get into a state after you've been triggered, and can you generally have the ability to access relaxation, which is antithetic to being overwhelmed by painful emotional states. This has basically been known in clinical psychology for 50 years, that it is relatively it's relatively hard to be upset if you're also relaxed at the same time. So teaching people relaxation as a general skill, but also teaching people how to use relaxation when they've been triggered can be a really big deal. Because we only have an hour for everything, I can only touch on things briefly, which hopefully that will focus you on going to find ways of handling this. The ITCT-A manual has specific information on the things that we'll describe, as do other trauma textbooks. So how do we help people develop relaxation? Some people use progressive relaxation algorithms. So this is noteworthy for two things. First of all, it probably works better than other methodologies because you can really develop deep relaxation in progressive relaxation algorithms. But a concern is actually we don't want the client too relaxed anyway. We want them to be de-escalated so that they are not being overwhelmed, but we don't want them to feel so great that they're not learning distress reduction by sitting with their emotional pain. The other part of it, though, is that progressive relaxation requires the therapist to take training in it typically, and it requires the therapist to train the client in it, and it's not simply done. Because we'll be talking about mindfulness as part of how we can help people work with self-injurious behaviors as well as other distress reduction behaviors, it seems very easy and handy to focus on breath training, which is another form of relaxation. So Dr. Semple, who's present on this call, and I did a study of a novel intervention for acutely burned survivors in a burn unit, and one of the things that we did in that context was see if we could teach them how to be able to breathe in such a way that their arousal dropped even when they were in great pain, and so that they would feel some level of relaxation. The funny thing about breath is, and this goes all the way back to Benson's notion of the relaxation response in the 1970s, he was a Harvard physician, is that generally the speed at which we breathe parallels the extent to which we feel anxious or relaxed. So if what breath training normally involves is breathing as a relaxed person. If any of us, including me, were to watch our breathing right now, if we weren't doing a formal meditation, we'd probably find out we're breathing a little faster than we need to. And if you buy what the data seems to suggest, more rapid breathing means we are more anxious than we have to be. The flip side of that is, if we could breathe more as a relaxed person, we'd be less anxious and we'd be more relaxed. We could, if we wanted, get into vagal systems, polyvagal theory, all kinds of things about why this works, and there are probably multiple sources of variance in that, but suffice it to say it does work. So we usually use some kind of a breath-based relaxation training. You can download this, I think, on the ITCT-A website. You can download it on my website. There's Randy's and my work, which is available for you as well. That was with burn survivors. We're obviously not specifically talking about burn survivors now. I would say, though, the fact that breath training is probably helpful for people in excruciating pain reminds us that you don't have to be in great shape to gain from relaxation. Lots of pain research suggests the more tense we are and fearful we are, and the more we label our pain as a negative state, usually the worse off we are in general. So if we can, even in severe trauma, learn how to breathe in such a way that we're more relaxed, that can really help us. Now, there are many algorithms out there, and I don't even know what's the best. We use a very simple one called the 1-2-3-3-2-1. There's also the 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then there's some ones that are even fancier than that. But basically, I like 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1 just because it's very straightforward. The survivor understands it very quickly. And basically, the idea is we ask them as they start to inhale, count 1. At mid inhalation, count 2. At the top or full inhalation, count 3. Pause. And then at the beginning of exhalation, count 3. In the middle of exhalation, count 2. Bottom of exhalation, count 1. And then pause. Why are we doing that? Because if I just asked you to slow down your breathing, it would be pretty idiosyncratic. You wouldn't have anything you wouldn't have a cadence or a way to pace your breathing. So interestingly, part of what this is all about is teaching people how to breathe at a certain speed by having their breath match their counting. Again, we can't have time to get into this too much, but that does mean in therapy, for instance, we might have them practice breathing 1, 2, 3, pause 3, 2, 1, and then see if they have the right cadence. One thing may be is the client counts too fast. They start with 1, they go to 2, then they go to 3, they pause, and they breathe out 1, 3, 2, 1 in just a few seconds. Well, that's not going to activate the systems that cause relaxation. That might actually activate further anxiety. Also, if you breathe rapidly, you can hyperventilate. So what we don't want to go is too far in the level of breathing fast. On the other hand, what if a client goes 1, they wait 10 seconds, 2, then they wait 10 seconds, and 3? Maybe for a few people that would work, but for many people that would produce oxygen hunger, which could push the person back into panic. So basically the idea is that you work with the client long enough that they can count and guide their own breathing in a regular way. And you teach them that so that A, they can use it during sessions, and B, that they can use it in the outside world when they're triggered by anything that might be upsetting them, typically related to early trauma or attachment difficulties. So breath training is a relatively easy thing to teach. We usually spend the beginning of a number of sessions having them practice it with the therapist present. And then also, kind of a cool thing is that when we want to teach people to regulate their emotional states, sometimes we teach them static tools, which are, when you get upset, try doing this. And that makes perfect sense and it's perfectly reasonable. But actually what would be cooler to teach people is to actually relax themselves when they are a little bit freaked out, when they are a little bit upset, etc. So what ironically, once we can teach breath training fairly well with our clients, and we want to do little touch-ups throughout therapy, is that in the middle of the session, if they're starting to get very, very upset, we're going to talk about something called interdigitation, which we have periods of processing pain and then periods of relaxation and grounding and mindfulness. That by asking the client to relax when they are in these states, what we're actually doing is a very powerful methodology to teach people how to learn how to relax when they're upset. You see the difference? So it's instead of learning how to relax and then if you get upset, try it. We're actually in the session giving them multiple opportunities when they are more activated to do some breathing at the same time to bring themselves down. The other half of that, though, is we talk about working within the therapeutic window. If the clients start to get too activated by memories or by things that are upsetting them, this breath stuff will also bring them down in a second so they can do more work. So a lot of times I think we clinicians sort of look down on relaxation and breath training because we think it's not really psychotherapy and that it's not really that helpful. And I understand that idea, but I can also tell you that lots of therapists have told me and have told others that they were shocked by how much breath training can help. Also, lots of therapists actually learn their own breath training by working with clients, and they report that it has positive impacts for them. We can also teach emotional regulation by having people get better at knowing what their emotions are. So in the ITCT-A model, we call this emotional detective work. And basically what it means is a funny thing goes on for a lot of severely traumatized people. They have very little ability to identify what their current emotional states are. So because they can't do that, they don't really know how to regulate the state. If you don't know whether you're very anxious or very angry, it could really matter in terms of what you do next. Are you going to do something to make yourself feel safer? Or are you going to do something to make sure that you don't strike out at others, or that maybe a metacognitive statement to yourself about you're angry about A and B and it's not C or whatever it might be. Part of this has led to several researchers, especially Foa's group, to discover that people who can't identify their emotions generally have a harder time regulating them and telling the difference between them. So for that reason, in ITCT-A as well as in related approaches, what we want to do is see if our clients can get better at better at figuring out their emotional states. So this might not look to you like this is part of emotional regulation training, but it actually is, because what it means is that if we can get better and better at knowing how we feel, that's going to actually increase our ability to regulate those emotional states. I'm sure that if I asked you if we could talk back and forth right now, you would tell me that some of your clients, when you ask them what they feel, they say fine or bad, or they say they give you one emotional state, but only one emotional state, or they say I don't know, which adolescents like to say. So in those kinds of contexts, you know, what we need to do is give them a way to figure out what their emotions are. So how are we going to do that? Well, the danger is we don't know what their emotions are. So you can't say, I know you like to say this. And sometimes if you're really sure of yourself, it's okay. But you might say something like, Fred, you seem quite angry to me. Can you tell me what's going on? The danger is Fred may not be angry, or he may be angry and scared and sad all at the same time. Sex rule training may have taught him to take the soft affects of just emotional distress and turn it into the hard affects of anger. We call that funneling. There may be a lot of reasons why what he thinks is his emotional state is not actually his emotional state. Also, because it's entirely possible to feel more than one thing at a time. For clients who are having multiple competing and discriminating states, it's going to be very hard for them to identify at any given moment exactly what they're feeling. So what can we do about that? Well, again, you do what you find is necessary in your work, but what we would recommend is that you don't tell clients ever what they're feeling. You just could be wrong, and if you're wrong and you could tell them that they're sad when they're mad, then they're going to get confused later about what's mad and what's sad. Also, we're trying to teach people how to figure out what their emotional states are. If we tell them what they are, then we're depriving them of the opportunity to figure out those states. So we do just a lot of emotional identification and discrimination. At the most minimal level, emotional identification interventions are saying to the client something really brilliant, like, what are you feeling? Or what's going on right now? At the beginning, they may not be able to tell you, but over time, if they're asked that 3 or 4 times in a session, they just may slowly be able to figure out more and more what their emotional states are. And other people with more severe presentations, if you ask them that, they basically can't, they'll just keep on telling you they don't know what they're feeling. And for that reason, we sometimes recommend emotional detective work. It has other names and other therapy approaches, but emotional detective work is to try to guess what your feelings are based on what your body and your mind are doing as far as you can tell. So clients, if you ask the client, what are they feeling? They say, I don't know. You could say, it looks like something's going on in your hands. What are you doing? Or you might say better than that. They say clenching their hands, or they're clenching their teeth, and they feel tightness in their scalp, or their heart rate just went up, or they suddenly had the thought they wanted to kill a person, or they suddenly had a flashback to violence, or whatever it might be. That what happens there, and at the beginning it's not entirely satisfactory, but it can grow, is that as the client gets better at guessing what their emotional states are based on what their thoughts and feelings are, they can slowly get to a place where they're just more able to identify emotional states when they encounter them. Sometimes, especially with younger clients, we'll use charts with smiley faces, or we may take a chance and tell them what we think is going on. If the person's acting terrified, you could say, you seem scared to me. I'm not saying don't ever do that, but more what the idea here is that you're giving the client repetitive opportunities to figure out what their emotional states are on an ongoing basis, which means asking about those feelings quite constantly. By the way, asking clients what they're feeling when they're processing trauma also may ground them and may bring them out of a dissociative response, which is also a good thing. We will also we'll see more of this in the next section, I think, on trigger management, but we want to see if they can practice developing distress reduction in another way, which is also, it has other benefits as well. But what we sometimes say to clients who engage in distress reduction behaviors is that when they get triggered into states that they want to engage in, that they try to not engage in the distress reduction behavior, whether it's binging, purging, compulsive sexual actions, or self-injury, that they try to hold off on engaging in that behavior for as long as possible. And then if they have to engage in the behavior after they've held off as long as possible, that they do as little as possible. So for instance, if you, let's just take binging and purging, if you felt maybe you had a relational trigger and suddenly you really, really want to eat awful badly, what we would ask you to do would be to resist the desire to eat. By that, we don't mean block it or push it away, that sense of resisting. We just mean that your desire to engage in a behavior that generally makes you feel better, like self-cutting, if you can go as long as possible, some benefits accrue. The first thing, by the way, is if I tell you not to cut on yourself when you came to see me for cutting, I've just really done a crazy making thing, right? If you could stop it, you wouldn't be coming to see me in the first place. So me getting you to sign a contract or saying you won't cut on yourself, that's not possible. I can't ask you to do that. But how about if I asked you to, when you do get triggered or when you do have states and you want to cut, that you keep from cutting for as long as possible? Well, two things tend to accrue from that. One is the longer that you can go without cutting over session after time, you are learning what Linehan calls distress reduction or distress tolerance. You're learning how to sit with an emotional state without having to do something about it. FOA, all kinds of CBT exposure people all will talk about this, that part of the advantage of feeling negative thoughts but not doing any, or feelings when not doing anything about it, is it starts to debunk the myth that you have to do something about it. So I don't know if this is making sense, but the idea here would be if I felt like cutting on myself, and every time I feel like cutting on myself, I just cut on myself, what I'm doing is reducing the opportunity for me to know what it feels like to sit without cutting on myself. And if I can do that long enough, an effective thing happens and a cognitive thing happens. The affective thing is, and we don't really understand how this works, we are just more able to tolerate emotional distress because we're more comfortable with it. We sit with it more. But what we're also doing is learning something. What we're learning is that solutions are not always great solutions, and they're sometimes engaged in too quickly, and that you can actually tolerate more than you think you can. And I think our clients feel that in therapy anyway. And if you've been in therapy, you maybe have felt that one of the things you learn in therapy is that crying won't kill you. Anger doesn't mean you're going to kill someone else. That feelings are just feelings. They're not more or less than feelings. And that the desire to block them, which it ultimately turns out not to be a good idea, may undercut our ability to just be able to say, it's not so bad that I have to do something right this second. Now, the other benefit of going as long as possible without doing something is that this, I'll talk about this I think later, is the half-life of activated distress, which comes, paraphrases from mindfulness-based response prevention, or no, mindfulness-based, I can never remember the other words for that, but at any rate, relapse prevention. So in those cases, what's actually happening here is that if you get triggered and you wait for 30 seconds to cut, what may happen is that the activated distress that you feel like you want to cut yourself over may actually fade because it's not being reinforced. So that's the half-life of triggered distress. One of the things we've discovered in mindfulness, but also in the cognitive behavioral range, is that if we can just not do something long enough, the motivation for it may fade, especially if it's emotionally based. So you might want to practice that for yourself. If you're in a relationship or you're in other situations where you want to yell at someone or you want to do whatever you might want to do, that if you sit with it long enough, you may notice that the feeling to do it is decreased enough that you no longer are overwhelmed by your states, even if your emotional regulation isn't really that strong. So go as long as possible is cool. The other cool thing about go as long as possible is you can't fail. If I tell you, don't cut on yourself between now and next week, yikes. But if I say, when you feel like cutting on yourself, try not to cut as long as possible. I wouldn't say, and then cut on yourself, because you don't ever want to tell people to do something that's bad for them, but just say, try to keep from doing it as long as possible. Guess what? You can come back every week having succeeded at that, even if you've cut yourself 4 times since the last session. But your goal was to take the activated emotional distress and try not to act on it for as long as possible. And it may wax and wane. Sometimes you can go 5 seconds, sometimes you can go 4 minutes. Sometimes the desire to cut will disappear entirely because you were lucky that week, and sometimes it won't. The idea is that you come back the next session and you report on how you resisted self-injury, how you went as long as possible without doing it, which means what? Every session is a reinforcement, not a punishment for your attempt to engage your own self-injury. Also, because we have been, as we talked about 2 weeks ago or whenever it was, we've expressed the etiology of why this is possible. They understand that their activation is not something to be ashamed of, which they hide from their therapist, but instead this is that personal trainer bit, which is, I got triggered as I do. It caused me to want to cut on myself, as it often does. That's because that's a coping strategy. I tried to keep from doing it for as long as possible. I was able to not do it for 15 seconds, then I had to do it. All of those things are actually good things. They're not bad things. And some people, therapists, have actually reported that clients were pleased to come back even if they engaged in a distress reduction behavior. So clear were they that the therapist wasn't going to judge them for that, because what happened was when they did have that stressor, that was a chance to learn skills and to more basically learn the cognitive notion that, that painful events are tolerable, and we don't always have to do what we thought we have to do about it. The second part of this is do as little as possible. What this means is if you do cut on yourself, could you stop yourself as soon as possible? This is a little tiny bit problematic because you don't ever want to tell people they should do it at all. And you are basically saying, well, if you do it as little as possible. But that's harm reduction. We know that in psychology and in other areas. You know, if you're going to have to cut, could you cut on yourself as little as possible? If you had to binge or purge, could you do that as little as possible? If you wanted to have sex with a stranger, could you just flirt with them? If you wanted to binge and purge, could you just have a taste rather than eating a huge amount? So the idea here is that we're sort of making a deal with the devil, although there's no devil. But the issue is, I'm trying not to do it as long as possible, and then if I have to do it, I'm doing it just the amount that I feel is necessary at that moment. Now, as we'll see in the next slide, some people will say that they'll do as little as possible by engaging in another behavior that's also painful or bad, but just doesn't seem as bad to them. So some people will like bite their fist rather than cut their wrist. And we'll talk about that. We call that replacing. It is something that you'll see on a lot of survivor websites and a lot of self-help groups. Survivors will share with each other how they can try to do something else rather than the cutting, like maybe draw on themselves, hold ice cubes, hold their breath until it hurts a lot, do push-ups until it really hurts to do push-ups. Because what they're really trying to do is switch on to something else. That may be or may not be helpful, but before we get on the do's and don'ts of exactly when you replace versus when you distract and those kinds of things, the basic notion here is that you go as long as possible without doing it, and when you do it, that you do it as little as possible. I know this might sound weird to you, but I have said to clients and to therapists to tell clients that in some sense, what we're trying to get you to do is to be better at self-injury. I know how weird that sounds. But if you didn't need to do it right away, then not doing it means you're better at it. If you a little cut on your wrist makes the pain go away enough, don't keep cutting. A lot of people will self-injure beyond actually where they need to self-injure, or they'll binge purge more than they have to, or whatever this distress behavior might be. So you're actually talking about actually getting better at it, better at whatever this behavior is. It's actually a trick though, because ultimately what we want is that the solutions you have to activated distress, you'll eventually be so good at it and you'll be able to tolerate it enough that although you get the activated distress, emotional regulation is strong enough that you don't have to actually engage in the cutting. This is a point that I like to make sometimes, which is when we treat people successfully for distress reduction behaviors, and self-injury is a great example, we haven't liposuctioned the problem out of their heads. They still can cut, they still have the potential for cutting. What we've done is we've rendered the necessity for cutting to some extent obsolete. Does that make sense? So in other words, if you notice, you work with a client who cuts themselves and then they've resolved this to some extent, they're no longer cutting, and then their partner breaks up with them, or they get in trouble at school or something else happens, then they start cutting themselves again, typically for a shorter period of time. It reminds us that nothing went away, it just was more directly dealt with. In inhibitory theory for exposure, this is called a delay of return of fear. And even in classic exposure therapy, some people, when they've had enough exposure therapy, they're no longer afraid of dogs or of, let's say, but then later they become afraid of dogs again. And this was an important thing for the prolonged exposure of people to figure out, which is they hadn't actually gotten rid of the fear of dogs. They've just changed the person's relationship to it, or the extent to which it's likely to come out. So in this case, as we are teaching delay, harm reduction, and emotional tolerance, what we're doing is teaching skills that make the cutting less necessary. We're not actually ever taking away the cutting. In fact, based on something I may talk about soon, and we'll see how it emerges, it looks like if you try to suppress emotional responses, you just make them stronger, you make them more powerful. So if you try not to self-injure in some classic sense of just blocking it and just trying to push those thoughts out of your head, the thought suppression literature specifically, and the suppression literature in general, says that may not work very well. So the idea is to be able to have those experiences but not have them overwhelm you. We could talk a lot more about that. So if you are an ITCT-A aficionado, I know not all of you are, but if some of you do ITCT-A, which is Integrative Treatment of Complex Trauma for Adolescents, you can go to our website to download the manual. It's entirely free. You can download videos, special topics, measures, instruments, all kinds of things around this stuff. But if you do use ITCT-A, you are familiar with an entire component called the trigger grid. And the trigger grid is a interaction, a worksheet, if you wish, that you do with the client, where they learn to figure out how they've been triggered, what to do about triggers, etc. And why this is important, and this goes back to 2 weeks ago or whenever it was, is, I think I probably harped on the notion that most distress reduction behaviors like self-injurious behavior don't come out of the blue. They're not a steady state response. They're typically a triggered response. So if your client goes home and cuts, for example, it's fairly likely that something about the session caused them to cut themselves. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong, although it might suggest you want to titrate exposure more in the future. It just means that there is something that caused it. So it's not just people trying to get attention. They're not trying to kill bad objects that they've introjected from unfortunate object relation scenarios in childhood. What they're basically doing is they've been triggered. It's produced overwhelming states that they can't regulate. And in the absence of sufficient regulation, they have to use dramatic behaviors like self-injury to make them go away. Then we have what in psychology is called negative reinforcement, which is not punishment, it's the reverse. It's when you get reinforced by the termination of a negative state. So if you cut on yourself and it makes you feel better, that reinforces you from cutting on yourself in the future. So triggering is a very important part of that. And we generally call this, more nowadays than when the ITCT-A manual first came out, we call this trigger management. And this is the component of the trigger grid. And I wish we could spend more time on it. We really can't. But let's talk about lessons that come from doing that work with the client and ways in which that work can cause the client to be more attuned mindfully to what their current experience is and what they might be able to do to keep from being overwhelmed and having to engage in the behavior. The important thing is with the trigger grid and with other trigger intervention models, it's important that they learn these models before they've been triggered, not after they've been triggered. We like to say the time to figure out what to do about being triggered is not after you've been triggered. So we spend some time in sessions working on the trigger grid, getting them to understand what are triggers. So psychoeducation about what triggers are, what triggers they've actually experienced, how they know they've been triggered, which may sometimes be that they don't know what the actual trigger is in the environment. They know they suddenly, though, got very, very upset and their heart rate's going fast and they're having really negative thoughts and weird memories are popping into their head. They could guess they've been triggered even though they haven't actually experienced, couldn't actually tell you what the trigger is. We sometimes call that direct versus indirect identification. So in psychoeducation, if you know that someone touching you sexually in a certain way triggers you into memories of being sexually abused by someone when you were little, if you can learn that, then what you could do is ask your partner not to touch you that way or work on it in whatever ways you want. And, you could have some success. But what if you don't realize that you're being triggered for that reason? All you know is that suddenly right now you're feeling panicky, you're feeling overwhelmed, and there was nothing in the environment that would actually explain that. and many trauma survivors will describe episodes of that. That's often most likely when they want to self-injure or do other distress reduction behaviors. Then what you can do is the trigger grid asks, among other things, when you've been triggered in the past, how do you know now that you were triggered then? What were the feelings you had after being triggered? So in the grid, they'll do things like, well, I knew my feeling was out of proportion to what was going on. I had a sudden feeling that came out of nowhere. I suddenly felt like a little kid. I suddenly had my heart rate went up, or I got a headache, or I suddenly had an intrusive thought that didn't fit, or whatever it might be. You can then identify the fact you've been triggered, even though you don't actually know what the trigger is. What happens over time, hopefully, and the trigger grid facilitates this, is the client gets better and better at knowing when they've been triggered, even if they don't recognize the trigger. This is part of something we're going to call metacognitive awareness. It's the ability to know that you're having an activated state, and that the activated state is not due to what's going on in the world right now. The activated state is due to the fact you're being triggered by what's going on in the world right now. But what you're feeling is what happened in the past. So as we get you better, more and more conversant with these things, you basically do what I think is probably one of the most important psychotherapeutic operations which can arise from mindfulness, is you can be more and more aware of whether your responses are due to the present or they're due to the past, or more typically that they're both of those things together. In Buddhism, we basically say, especially the Zen Buddhists will basically stress that we're almost in a dream, that we aren't in reality, because so much of our experiences and perceptions in the world are actually partially the result of attachments and confusions and lack of understanding about things, which cause us to, to basically move through life thinking we're in reality when we're not. Now, that's not like good, bad, cool, uncool, but the problem is if you're being triggered in negative states, knowing you've been triggered is a hell of a first step. And if you can't figure that out, then you won't have metacognitive awareness. You won't be able to say to yourself, oh my God, I've been triggered because this guy's mean comment in the bar is causing me to remember what my brother did to me when I was a kid, and I'm feeling great emotional distress. All of those cognitive things allow you to know that I'm not actually in the here and now when I'm feeling these things. These feelings are from the past. I know it's a kind of an overstatement, but I use the phrase nothing to be afraid of, or nothing to be upset about. It doesn't mean that you're not upset and then it's not valid for you to be upset because you're experiencing the past, but the actual upset feelings you're having may be primarily due to the past, not to the present. And then what that does is that teaches you metacognitive awareness, so that when you do have strong feelings or urges or flashbacks or memories, that you can figure out that this thing that you're feeling is not just about the now. Can you think, I don't know if that's making sense to you, but can you imagine that if later today you're talking with your partner and suddenly they really piss you off and you want to yell at them, that it might be very helpful in you not yelling at them if you knew that actually what you were yelling about was a mixture between their slight assholedness and what your actual deep feelings are about how someone treated you in the past that was really, really horrible, and that the mixture of the two is producing great emotional distress. That kind of awareness may interfere with you acting on your distress, because in fact, you start to realize, and again, you don't want to discount people about anything they're doing, but you start to realize that what you think is happening is not happening, and what's happening is not as bad as what you think is happening. So the extent to which we can be aware of triggers, triggering, and triggered states is the extent to which we may be able to intervene in them by changing our relationship to them. And that's a very Buddha-ish mindfulness thing to say, that you change your relationship to internal experience. The experience still arises, but you don't go, the world must be very dangerous because I'm scared. You might instead say, I'm scared, and it might be that there's danger out there, but it also might be that I'm triggered into fears from the past. In trigger management, we also want you to take a step further, which is the first step is you're going to want to know what your triggers are. But then the next step is, what could you do to not move from those triggered states into having to engage in a distress reduction behavior like SIB? So this is where we talk about learning coping strategies throughout therapy. And this is also in the trigger grid to some extent, which is problem solving with your therapist week after week, coming back with new triggered states so you have more to talk about, problem solving with your therapist over time. What could I do when I got activated into states that were powerful enough that I want to hurt myself? And generally, what you can do is you can learn to problem solve so that you can terminate the triggered state or alter it. This could mean moving away from an upsetting situation so you're not further triggered. But we especially talk about self-talk, which is what could you say to yourself when you've been triggered? And generally, you could say things that are just contradictory to what you're saying to yourself. Like if you're filled with shame and self-hatred and you want to cut on yourself, although some people think it's elementary, it's not. I've had nuclear physicists use this in their own work, that to just say to yourself, I'm not a bad person. The things I'm saying to myself aren't true. That's not what's really going on here. I'm a good person. I deserve more than this. Whatever it is you might say. Sometimes call that positive self-talk. But the other thing is what we could call metacognitive self-talk. And again, you can go to the manual that we've written and that you can download it at the ITCT-A website on how to do this stuff. But metacognitive self-talk would be what? It's when you explicitly make the connection. You go, you're activated and you say, this is just my past talking. This is just my childhood. This is the abuse. Do you hear the just, which we use a lot in Buddhism and in mindfulness? It's just this. It's not necessarily that. So it's just my childhood. I've often found benefit to myself earlier on to say to myself when I got activated into rage towards men that were due to the rage I felt at having two abusive fathers, is I actually just had a little joke I would say to myself when I would get angry around men, which is just, hi, Dad. Hello, Dad. If you see that that's a metacognitive statement, it's saying, although I'm reacting to in a faculty meeting, actually it's not the chair of the department so much as it is maybe there was a little bit there or I wouldn't have been triggered, but that what really is happening is stuff that's happened in the past. So in the trigger grid and in therapy, we actually work this through a lot. We have them talk, okay, if you got triggered this way, what would you say to yourself? What could you do? Where could you go? What would be a great solution? Let's see how I'm gonna, we can actually ask you, if you do get triggered in those things, could you maybe find something else to do that's less upsetting? That's that do less if you can find something else. Ideally, something that's not hurtful to you. Or the other thing we could do is, could we do things, we don't normally want to distract ourselves. Remember, and generally in therapy and in mindfulness, we don't want to distract. But a lot of cycling internal processes are fed by our awareness. So if we can pull our attention away from what I call endogenous cycling, circular, panic produces panic, which produces panic, flashbacks trigger flashbacks, which trigger flashbacks. If we can move our attention outside of that through grounding activities, okay, what that can do is give that internal stuff a chance to calm down a little more than it otherwise might. It's in this whole context also that we're working with the client to, when they are having those activated states, that they not only try to keep from engaging in the behavior, but that they try to surf the behavior, they try to ride with the feeling. So this comes from Kabat-Zinn, who once said very famously, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. In other words, you can't stop negative feelings, but you can change how you respond to negative feelings. And the big idea here goes back to the half-life of triggered states, which is that as you learn to urge your emotions surf, what you're learning how to do is learning how to become comfortable with distress, learning how to feel distress without having to act on it, actually in a way playing with your distress, moving into it a little bit, moving out of it. There's a bunch of exercises here, but you're actually basically learning how to have the feeling but not have to engage in the behavior. And that because triggered distress will fade on its own, some people magically say that triggered distress fades in a half an hour if you don't either hang on to it or push it away. I don't know how anyone ever worked out that metric, but I think it's an antidote to the notion that once you get triggered, you're going to be in that state for hours. You're probably not going to be. Mindfulness training, which I wish we could spend more time on, is basically just another version of this stuff, but it's basically teaching you to be aware of your ongoing experience, including your triggered and activated states, so that when you do get triggered into states, you don't add to them by criticizing your criticism or being ashamed of your shame or trying to avoid emotional distress. You allow yourself to become more of a dispassionate observer in your hurtful or painful feelings, and that often involves some form of not judging yourself and accepting yourself. There's a lot of circularity there. that we could probably get into more, but the basic notion here is that the more that you can become a participant observer or a dispassionate observer of your own internal experience, which is what one of the major payoffs of mindfulness is, then the less that's going to translate into you having to do something because it's not personal for you. It sounds weird, but you can get to the point where triggered emotional states may not feel like it has to do with now in reality or about you. Also, what we find is that mindfulness can be a very useful thing to insert once one's become escalated. So when you're in an emotional state and you're now being triggered and you're having very painful internal emotional states or cognitions, that you can spend minutes sitting with those thoughts and saying metacognitive things to yourself, and thereby just de-escalating acute states. Okay, and given that Randy gave me the 5-minute indicator a while ago, and I can see that I have 3 minutes left. Why is this at the end? Why isn't this at the beginning? Because if you think about it, what we're saying is that people have trauma and attachment dysregulation, which creates distress. It's triggered by reminiscent phenomena in the current environment. Then if you have enough skills, coping skills, emotional regulation skills, metacognitive awareness, you don't actually have to do something as dramatic and hurtful as self-injury. You can somehow take care of it beforehand. Doesn't it sound like, well, it's pretty downstream to be trying to teach you what to do once you've been triggered. Wouldn't it be groovier, cooler, wonderfuler if we could have you not feel so bad when you do get triggered? That generally falls in the rubric of emotional processing, emotional exposure. What it means is that activated states are less overwhelming because the memories themselves have been sufficiently processed that just remembering something doesn't produce as much distress as it otherwise might. So why not start with that? I alluded to this at the beginning. Most people who do involve in self-injury have problems with emotional regulation. If we ask them to process emotional states or memories before they have emotional capacities to do so, that's cruel and unusual punishment, isn't it? It's making you try to do something that you're not ready for. So when we do therapy exposure, we both titrate it. We make sure we don't ask them to process more than their existing emotional capacities. We call that working within the therapeutic window. But we also talk about it beforehand, what we're going to do, what it's about, make sure that they understand that although we normally do emotional regulation, we're going to do a little bit of trying to talk about painful events, but that the therapist or the client will terminate talking about those events if those events start to be overwhelming. We call that undershooting and overshooting. You can read about it in various textbooks and certainly in the ITCT-A manual. Undershooting is when you don't ask people to process things they could, and that since exposure is a good idea, that's a problem. More importantly, though, for a lot of people involved in distress reduction is overshooting, that actually the therapist asks the client or the client asks themselves to talk about stuff they're not ready to do, so they get very, very overwhelmed and they don't have the emotional regulation capacities to handle it. So you can see why we want to wait later in therapy typically to do large parts of emotional processing, although if you read the manuals, you'll see we do some right off, but it's very small, eensy bits because the therapeutic window is very small. And that generally we try to bring the client down before the end of the session in doing processing of painful memories, because if you don't, what would be the problem with this? If this is the arousal in the session, it goes up and then that's the end of the session. The problem is that the client has to find a way to come back down again after the session is over. They're probably going to pull on distress reduction behaviors, including self-injury. So what we want to do is make sure by the end of the session, we've brought them back using some of the grounding techniques and mindfulness techniques we've talked about, so they leave the session in a relatively more positive state. In the newest writing we're doing in this area, we call this interspersal. Interspersal, which is a new construct and it goes against classic notions of prolonged exposure, basically say that for many of our clients, it may be helpful for them to ground and practice and learn metacognitive self-statements and emotional regulation and mindfulness, et cetera, during the session. When they're in relatively grounded states, then we ask them to talk about things that we know are what gets triggered for them and causes them to want to do distress reduction. We don't ask them to do that more than they have to. And then we actually, after maybe just a few minutes, ask them to again do more mindfulness and more relaxation, or we do some kind of relational interaction that triggers the oxytocin response associated with positive relatedness between client and therapist. That's also interspersal. If while you're working this, you're getting upset and I say, Susan, you're doing such a great job. I'm so proud of you. You've just come so far. you got to be a little careful with praise because it makes it sound like there's good and bad ways to be, and maybe they'll relapse back into the bad person. You don't want to do that so much as what you want to do is take advantage of the positive therapeutic relationship, which will produce positive states, which can, when experienced, neutralize some of the negative states they're having at the same time. And then very lastly, we want to have them explore and develop a narrative on their painful internal states. ITCT-A talks about that a lot. It has a handout called Written Homework About My Trauma, where you talk about a single trauma and you go into detail about it and you try to figure out what it's all about and see if you can develop what Foe and others called coherent narratives. Coherent narratives mean that the trauma makes sense. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's understandable where it comes from, what your reactions are all logical. Some of this comes from the homework, although we don't recommend that for people that are too easily overwhelmed. But generally, it comes from just the process of psychotherapy as you move in and out of these states. Well, I'm sorry to have gone so fast here, and I know that I covered too much, but the first article here is by Aaron, Edie, and myself. We actually looked in a large structural equation model what actually antedates self-injurious behavior, finding out how dissociation has a role, finding out how activation emotional distress has a role, how much does emotional regulation matter. We moved that into a big fancy path analysis, and we're able to show that self-injury in these contexts is compensatory. It's a way to downregulate painful states, even though it has negative experiences. I think you can download them on my website for free. The Briere, Langtry, and Semple is the self-injury manual. So I would really go for that if you found any part of this very helpful, which is actually takes you through how you can actually use the things we've talked about to give people more self-control, more emotional regulation, less self-criticism, and more metacognitive awareness. Randy's manual with myself teaching you how to use mindfulness in traumatized clients would obviously be very, very helpful here. It takes a while to learn mindfulness. You don't want to use mindfulness in your clients until you've developed enough of your own abilities and you have your own practice in the first place. Some people try to teach their clients mindfulness when they don't know much about it themselves, when they may not have a meditational tradition. This manual with Randy Semple basically gives you a background and a scaffolding for how mindfulness works and how we might approach it so that we can develop greater skills. And then I just put the last one in there because Walsh and Rosen, way beforehand, started the idea of self-mutilation, and they wrote some of the earliest stuff in that area. Probably a lot of it we wouldn't totally agree with now. But if you want to read a really nice book, you might want to read Walsh's book by himself in 2012 for Guilford called Treating Self-Injury, A Practical Guide, to get more involved in this. You will notice, and you'll notice this in various contexts, that not everybody has the same theories for why self-injury works. So, of course, to the extent that Walsh thinks it has to do with low self-esteem, he's going to talk more about bolstering self-esteem. I'm going to work more with having you not be criticized when you have negative thoughts, to basically mindfully deal with those thoughts so that they don't affect you so much. So it's not so much we're trying to eliminate your self-esteem, we're trying to change your relationship to low self-esteem so it doesn't hurt so much, for example. And I think that's about it. And I think we're out of time. In fact, I think we're over time.
Thank you very much, John. That was just chock full of information. If you haven't noticed, I've been posting information about ITCT-A and the resources that are available in the chat box. If you click on the three buttons at the bottom right hand, you can save all of the links that are there. I encourage you to visit our website and take a look at what offerings there are, as well as the ITCT-A clinician training program. Thank you all for attending.
Bye-bye.